South Africa unveiled some pretty crazy regulations around the apps that we use to book rides, platforms like Uber and Bolt. Now, the rules are extensive and significantly change how this industry would operate in the country. But despite the changes being widely discussed for months, it has only been Bolt so far that is actually registered under this new system. And once you see what these new rules actually require, it becomes a little bit easier to understand why. Now, what these new rules require are far more visible than most people realize. You see, these ride-hailing cars may now have to display both company branding as well as driver's details on the front doors so that the passengers can clearly identify them. While the apps themselves have to strengthen safety features like panic buttons and emergency assistance. Platforms also expected to provide clearer information about the drivers inside the app. And behind all this sits the more formal shift. You see, platforms must now formally register with the National Public Transport Regulator and prove that their apps and operations meet the new requirements. Companies were given a 180-day window to comply, with that window expected to close on the 11th of March. And so after that point, any platform that is not registered could technically be operating illegally. Now, the push for these changes is largely about safety. You see, supporters say that clearer driver identification, stronger in-app emergency tools, and tighter licensing could make ride-hailing safer for both passengers and drivers alike. But critics say that the question of fairness still lingers. You see, if the goal is stricter oversight of passenger transport, I think you can see where I'm going with this. They argue that the same level of scrutiny should be applied to our notorious taxi industry. As for you though, what do you think? For decades, global trade ran on a simple idea. Countries should buy the best products available wherever they're made. And Europe was one of the loudest defenders of that system. But now the EU is considering a Buy European rule that would tilt the scales in favor of its own industries, effectively asking government to prioritize locally made technology when they spend public money. Now, the mechanics are fairly straightforward. Governments across the EU spend enormous amounts building things like wind farms, battery factories, hydrogen plants, and other green infrastructure. And under this proposal, companies competing for those contracts would need to prove that a decent chunk of their equipment and the supply chain behind it actually come from Europe rather than being imported from somewhere else. And the reason this is happening now is the part that really matters. You see, China currently dominates a lot of the industries behind clean energy, like solar panels and increasingly battery supply chains. At the same time, the United States has already started rolling out its own Buy American incentives through its Inflation Reduction Act. And so Europe suddenly finds itself trying to protect its own industrial base, even if that means borrowing a strategy it has spent years criticizing. Believe it or not, Woolworths managed to make more and less money at the same time. You see, in its latest half-year results, the retailer reported a turnover growth of about 5.4% to roughly 42.5 billion rand. But the profit before tax moved the other way, dropping around 23% to about 2 billion rand. In other words, the business sold more but earned less from those sales. Now, a big part of that answer sits in the Woolworths food business. While many retailers are struggling to get shoppers through the door, Woolies food sales actually climbed by about 7%. The company even says that it gained market share over that period. As for Woolies Dash, it's also expanding. Sales through the platform jumped 23% and now makes up over 7% of their food revenue. In other words, people are still buying their groceries at Woolies and increasingly getting them delivered. So why did profits fall? Well, parts of it comes down to discounting. You see, Woolworths ran more promotions to clear excess stock and cut prices to remain competitive in some areas. At the same time, the group is investing heavily in infrastructure, including the expansion of its Midrand distribution center. Add to that a difficult retail environment in Australia, and the picture becomes clearer. Woolworths is still growing, it's just spending a lot of money to do it. And before we cruise on to our Bagel Bite of the day, here's a couple other headlines worth knowing. For starters, oil prices are surging and the rand has taken a sharp knock after tensions escalate in the Middle East. Brent crude jumped about 12% in 2 days, raising concerns about higher fuel prices and inflation in South Africa. Government says that it is shifting to an intelligence-driven strategy to fight organized crime, bringing in multiple agencies under a central command structure, targeting gang violence, extortion, hijacking, and infrastructure crimes, though the challenge will be funding and implementation. And preparations for national health insurance are continuing despite a court order pausing the rollout of the law. While implementation is on hold pending constitutional court challenges, the health department says that groundwork like hospital upgrades will continue. And on to our bagel bite of the day. But first, just a side note, if you're enjoying the show, put a smile on my dial and hit that like and subscribe button. It helps us to grow more than you know. And now, with that out the way, let's see what you got. The question is, which African country has the highest population? Is it A, Nigeria, B, Ethiopia, or C, Egypt? We'll give you the answer at the end of the show. And on to our final story of the work week. I think we've heard enough news. So here's a story I think you're all going to enjoy. If you've had a rough week, here's a bit of perspective. There was once this man documented in the 1800s who spent most of his life losing. In his 20s, he started a business that failed and left him in debt for years. He then thought that government was a good idea, so tried to run for state legislator and lost. And in the middle of all that, the woman that he planned to marry died suddenly, which reportedly left him in a deep depression. And that pattern didn't really change as he got older. He kept running for bigger roles, Congress, the Senate, and even the vice presidency, and most of those campaigns ended in defeat too. And so if you looked at his track record at the time, the obvious conclusion would have been that politics simply wasn't working out for him. And yet, after decades of failing forward, in his early 50s, that same man was elected as the President of the United States. He would go on to lead the country through the Civil War and signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the order that essentially began the end of slavery in the United States. His name was Abraham Lincoln, which is a useful reminder that the timeline of doing something meaningful is rarely as neat as we imagine. And so, hey, if you've had a tough week, enjoy the downtime, but keep that chin up. You're doing better than you think. And as for that bagel bite, the answer is Nigeria, by a wide margin. You see, Nigeria has more than 220 million people, making it not just the most populous country in Africa, but the 6th most populous country in the world. For context, Ethiopia sits around 125 million and Egypt around 110. And my friends, that's it for today's show, and that is it for the work week. Thanks so much for tuning in. We really appreciate your support. And now, I hope you guys have a cracker Friday further. Be kind to one another. Enjoy the downtime this weekend. And I'll catch you all on Sunday evening for the next round of the good stuff. God bless.